So this talk of the Rebbe is from 1984. So 1984 is already when the Rebbe is deep into this focus on Noahides, on transforming the world, on how the whole world really is supposed to be serving God. So in this talk, the Rebbe says something that was really interesting. Never heard it before. It's based on the prophet Zechariah. This is the first chapter of Zechariah. And he says, Zechariah says, I'm not going to say the whole thing word for word. The angel says, I've gone on the whole world, and the whole world is quiet. He says, God, until when will you have compassion on Jerusalem? That you've already been angry at them for 70 years. This is the 70 years of exile after the destruction of the first temple. So says God, I'm going to take vengeance for Jerusalem. I'm going to take a great vengeance for Zion. And I'm very angry. I have tremendous anger on the nations that are quiet. Remember, the angel said he saw the whole world as quiet. Because I was angry a little, and they helped. They added much, much, much evil. And therefore, God says, I'm returning to Jerusalem in compassion. My home will be built there. So says the God of the host. God is looking at this prophecy of his and focusing on it in terms of, as I would say, the Noahides, or in terms of the Gentiles. We look at what God is saying here, and God's saying he's really upset at the nations of the world. He's angry. The word that's used, it's a very strong term. He's angry at the nations of the world. Why is he angry at the nations of the world? Because they're quiet. There was two different phrases in this prophecy. First, originally, if you remember, the angel said he looked all over and everything's quiet. And then, second time, when he speaks about the nation specifically, he says they're all quiet. And God gives two reasons why he's upset at the nations of the world. One reason is the nations were a tool of punishment for the Jewish people. And God's saying, I was a little angry at the Jews, and boy, did you guys go overboard in how you afflicted them. That's one reason God is giving for being angry at the nations. And the second reason God is giving is because they're quiet. Because the nations are quiet. Why do you think God is upset? Because the nations are quiet. The Jews are suffering. The Jews are in exile. The Jews are in a hard situation, and the nations are quiet. And God's saying, this is a huge problem. Why do you think it's a huge problem?
Because they won't defend them. They won't come to their help.
God is saying the nation should not be quiet. The nation should be involved. The nation should be caring. The nation should be active. The nation should be doing whatever they can to help the plight of the Jews. And they're quiet. And God said, I'm really upset. I'm really upset that the nations of the world are quiet.
Reminds me of the saying, silence is deafening.
Yes, yes, exactly. We like to think silence is innocent, but it really isn't. It's really very loud. Zechariah is saying here, that's exactly the prophecy. So there's two elements here on why God is saying he's upset at the nations. The first is he's upset at how they harmed the Jewish people. And the second is for this deafening silence. So in terms of how they harmed the Jewish people, you could say, well, everything's coming from God. Obviously, the Jews sinned, the Jews transgressed. The Jews here were sent into exile. Obviously, they deserved to be sent into exile. The Jews were suffering. Obviously, they deserved to suffer. But that doesn't take away God's upsetness at the nations who are harming the Jewish people. So there's two elements here. There's the silence, which is really going to be the main focus, but we're going to put that on the side because first we're going to deal with this simpler but nothing simple concept. The Jews sinned. The Jews transgressed. They transgressed enough to warrant punishment. And the punishment came in the form of the armies of, but here we're talking about the Babylonians, later it was the Romans, in between was the Assyrian Greeks. There were many, there was a certain time the Egyptians, there were many armies that came and ravaged the Jewish people. Now obviously every single time that happened, the Jews deserved it. If they didn't deserve it, God would have protected them and nothing would have happened. But even though they deserved it, God is still upset at the nations that are doing it. It's almost like we can understand, and this of course is applicable in our lives all the time, that God declares things. But the tool he's going to use is going to be as per the task. So if these people are the tool to bring evil in the world, to bring harm in the world, to bring devastation in the world, that means they're pretty corrupt people because they're fitting for this job. They're fitting to be chosen for this task. Sort of like there's a classical question, why were the Egyptians punished for subjugating the Jews? Now, obviously, they were horrific, they were cruel, it was unbelievable savagery what they did to the Jews for some 116 years. But it was all scripted. God, 300 plus years before, said the Jews would be enslaved, the Jews would be subjugated in this foreign land. So why are the Egyptians punished? This is God's script. And there's many different answers given. Some say, well, they went overboard. They did more than God was asking. Some say, well, they didn't know it was God's script. They weren't doing it because, okay, God, this is your script. I know. They just did it because they wanted to do it, and it happened to be, of course, that everything fits into God's script. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe explains that God had this plot. God had this plan. But when he's looking in the world, because when he told Abraham that your children will be enslaved, they will be foreigners, they will be subjugated, they will be treated with cruelty for 400 years, God doesn't say it's going to be by the Egyptians. He just says it's going to happen. Why did it happen through the Egyptians? Because they were the people in the world that were the most evil, the most cruel, the most immoral. So when God's looking in his world for who should be the tool of this, they were the ones chosen. They were chosen because of their evil. And because they're so evil, that's why evil came through them. Sort of like if someone does something nice for me, you're on the phone with the gas company and they actually make something simple instead of complicated, or something along those lines. Or with an airline or a bus ticket or something like that. I've had many such calamities go on. And they'll say, everything, thank you very much. Everything comes from God. And I truly thank God for this working out, but God does good things through good people. Since God does good things through good people, thank you for being the good tool God chose to do this good with. And I mean that very sincerely. If something good just happened, that person is a good person because God's choosing to use them to do something good in his world. And obviously the opposite is true. So when God is saying he's angry at the nations because how they afflicted the Jewish people, even though it was his plan for the Jews to be afflicted and the Jews sinned and, so to speak, deserved the punishments and deserved the affliction, but that doesn't take away the evil in the nations that were the ones that carried out this evil to the Jews. It's like if God's going to use us, we want him to use us for his good. We don't want to be the tool he's using to inflict harm on someone. And here already comes into a certain degree the idea of free choice. Where is free choice? Free choice is really an oxymoron. Free choice, like the more you believe in God, the less free choice makes any sense. Meaning if you really believe in God and you really know it's all him and you really know he runs his world, then what do you mean you're choosing? What are you choosing? Everything's God. And yet somehow we choose. So what do we choose already? Obviously anything we're choosing is unusual. It's like God is like shifting the rules a bit to give us space to choose. Because the natural de facto it's all him. He's scripting everything. Yeah, we think we're going through choices as humans, but it's really all him. So the only place we can choose is in the realm of serving God. Only with service of God is there choice. Because again, choice doesn't even really make sense. So I think I chose to live in Kansas versus to live in Chicago, to be with this person or to be with this person. Those are things that seem to me as a human being I'm choosing. But really, God's decreeing, God's making these things happen. God's putting everything in place. So do I have any choice? I have choice in terms of my service of God. So when it comes to a question of like to serve or not to serve like this or to serve like this, that's where God gives us the miracle of free choice. So therefore, in a sense, you could say for all these nations that are the tools of harshness, of punishment, of cruelty to the Jews, well, those nations clearly are not serving God. They're clearly going against the laws of Noah. So that means there is some choice there. They did have a choice, and yet God has a script. But because of their own evil, they're naturally choosing to follow that script and be the tools of harm for the Jewish people. So in such people, God is saying, I'm very angry. I'm angry. Yes, I plotted this all, but I'm angry at you for fulfilling it. I'm angry at you for being such evil people that you on your own, so to speak, chose what was my plot. So that's what's one dimension of what God is saying here in terms of his anger. But then we could say that anger we understand to a certain degree. Obviously, it's God's plot, but obviously they're evil, and because they're evil, they're making evil choices because there is something to do with being a Noahide. And so it's a combination of God's plot and man's evil, which are perfectly dovetailing together, and man is choosing. Like if we would look at Hamas or Hezbollah or Iran or the Houthis, any of this today, I mean, yeah, we don't have to think into the past. Obviously, these are horrifically evil people that are choosing horrifically evil paths, which doesn't take away God's script. It doesn't take away that God's running his world and that God plans every step. And at the same time, people of such evil are going to be the players of this script. And people of such evil are making choices that align with this script because of their own evil. God has his reasons. Their reasons are not God's reasons. Their reasons because of their evil. So we see this playing out, fortunately now, in vivid color every day. So that piece of God saying, I'm really angry at these nations that are afflicting the Jews, we understand. That makes sense. Even though God plotted it, even though the Jews deserved it, we still understand the evil of these people and the evil of the choices they're making. But why is God so upset at the nations that are quiet? So the Rebbe says, do we see this as one of the Noahide commandments? We know the commandments. There's 7 broad categories. Is one of the commandments that you have to feel pain for the pain of the Jewish people? And if it's not part of the Noahide commandments, then how could we say that God's upset that the nations are behaving this way? Are we adding an 8th commandment? You're not allowed to add. There are 7. There's not 8. So if you're scanning the 7 in your head, right? Idolatry, adultery, murder, the limb of an animal, cursing, stealing, courts of justice. We know incorporating that is charity, is honoring your parents. Where does it say in there, thou shalt feel the pain of the Jews? Thou shalt do whatever you can to protect the pain of the Jews. And if it doesn't say it there, what are we? We're adding to their laws? And anyway, what difference does it make if the nations feel bad for what's happening to the Jews? How will this make a difference? It's going to change things. The Jews are in exile. God sent them in exile. God's not changing his plans. If the nations are upset, if the nations are sympathetic, if the nations are indifferent, it's not going to change the situation of our exile. That came from God. So what are we even caring or blaming or pushing the nations to do something? The Rebbe says, it is part of the Noahide laws. It's part of the Noahide laws to be sensitive to the pain of the Jews. Where do you think it's in the Noahide laws?
Possibly do not steal, do not harm. I don't know.
Okay, we could think maybe do not steal because stealing is harming. Okay, any other thoughts? Where in the Noahide laws could there be something that would be implying you can't passively allow the Jews to be suffering?
Courts of justice?
Justice? You only have 7 choices, right?
I know. I'm just going to go through the whole 7. Yeah, you tell me.
Which of the 7 most resonates as so Dixie proposed 2. Not stealing, which would be not harming, not allowing harm, not allowing them to be stolen from. There makes sense there. Courts of justice. The courts are supposed to create a just world. And obviously how the Jews were treated was not at all with justice.
I agree with both of those.
Those both sound good. Sabras, Dixie,
Yeah.
that was great thinking. Danielle, you have any thoughts on this?
I'm honestly not sure. You got me racking my brain, that's for sure.
I'm not saying I would have thought of it either. I'm giving over the talk, so I'm wise because I already read it. I don't know if I would have come up with it either. The Rebbe says not to take the limb of a living animal.
Wow.
Why would that translate to being compassionate, being kind, trying to protect the Jewish people?
I almost said that at first, and I thought, no, that's just too far fetched to be
All right,
right.
Dixie, what were you thinking
Say
at
that.
first before you decided it was too far-fetched?
Yeah, I just did. It was just too far fetched.
But what were you thinking? What would be the connection of the limb of a living animal and protect the Jews?
Because taking a limb of a living animal, the animal cannot fight back. The animal is at your mercy, and you take its limb, it can't, the animal, I'm trying to explain it and I can't quite say it, but the animal is has no recourse or can't fight back. So it just lets you take it because it can't stop you. So that's what I think. So
I hear that. Any other thoughts on that? Like, why? What would be the connection between the commandment of not taking the limb of a living animal and standing up for the Jews?
Seems like they're both defenseless.
That's, I think, sort of what Dixie is saying.
Yeah, I think that's what Dixie meant.
Not to allow suffering?
Not to allow suffering. That's more the point the Rebbe goes to. The Rebbe says, when you're commanded not to take the limb of a living animal, why? Basically, because it's cruel.
yeah,
Because it's an act of cruelty to this animal. You're being cruel, and as Dixie said, and as Sabra said, the animal's helpless, the animal's defenseless, the animal is being violated, and there's nothing the animal can do because you're man. So it's being cruel at the expense of an animal. It's really cruel to the animal. And when God is telling us not to take the limb of a living animal, God is telling us don't be cruel. And the Rebbe says, if there's a commandment telling you not to be cruel to animals, how much more so does God want you not to be cruel to man? If God is saying you're not allowed to be cruel to an animal because I don't want you to be a cruel person. I don't want the animal suffer, and I don't want you to be the type of person that would make an animal suffer. I don't want you to be a cruel person. I don't want you to be indifferent to pain. Even the pain of an animal, I don't want you to be indifferent to. And I want you to be careful for the pain of an animal. What Rebbe says, if the nations are injuncted to be sensitive to the pain of an animal, of course, implicit in this, obviously, is to be sensitive to human pain. So when the nations are quiet, that's how Zechariah is describing them. When they're quiet, the Jews are suffering, the Jews are being tormented, the Jews are being abused, and the nations are quiet, saying, no, you can't be quiet. Well, I'm not doing it. I'm not harming. I'm not doing anything wrong. I wouldn't do it. If you're sensitive to pain, if you're sensitive to cruelty, you wouldn't allow it to be done. You wouldn't allow people to be harmed, as of course the Jews were violated again and again and again for over 2,000 years. You wouldn't allow that to happen if you're sensitive to pain. As a Noahide, the Rebbe is saying, the Rebbe is talking now to the world of Noahide. As a Noahide, you have to be careful not to be indifferent to human pain and human suffering. So we're not adding another injunction on the Noahide. This isn't, commandment number 8. This is part of the 7 commandments, and it's really interesting how the Rebbe is globalizing not taking the limb of an animal and saying it means don't be cruel. Don't be cruel to animals, and don't be cruel to man. And cruelty, we're saying, is when someone's in suffering and someone's in pain and you're indifferent. That's called cruelty. Don't be cruel. Don't be cruel. Don't be indifferent to that suffering. As Dixie said, the Noahides have the injunction to make courts of justice. As I mentioned, they have the injunction of giving charity. That all of this, again, expresses that God wants them to be moral people, leading moral lives and creating moral civilizations. And obviously, in a moral civilization, we're not apathetic to someone else's pain. What would happen if the nations were sensitive? Well, what would happen if the nations had been sensitive to the pain of the Jewish people? What do you think would have happened?
that's a good question, because the nations were who caused the Jewish people to sin. And so if they weren't cruel to the Jewish people might have never separated from the nations.
So what you're saying, Dixie, is you're explaining God's plot. You're saying that, as I would say, if we forget who we are, don't worry, the world will remind you.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That's absolutely true. And we've seen it again and again and again and again and again and again in our history. If we forget, if we think we're like everyone else, the world will say, nope, you are not. You are different. You are a despised Jew. We don't like you. You look just like
Well,
us. You dress just like us. You talk just like us. You eat just like us. You act just like us. You're not fooling us. You're a Jew. We don't like
I
you.
have to make a comment
You're a
on
Jew.
that, please. I have the opposite take with me. My thing is, I'm here to make sure they don't be like me. I try and emulate them, what Torah says. But my Jewish friends, I get them after them quite harshly because they want to do what the people are doing. And I say, you are a Jew. You have no idea the specialness of you, and you can't be doing what I do. That is not your place. My place is to help you make sure you don't come across and be like me.
That's
And
wonderful. That's a good Noahide.
well, I don't know, but I mean, I get quite upset because it's like you guys don't get it. You're the chosen ones. You're supposed to be the example for us, not taking us as your example. We take you as our example, not you take us as your example.
Absolutely. But going back to this point Dixie was making, so Dixie is saying, wait a minute. The nation should be all nice and supportive for the Jews, but isn't God setting them up as the staff, the whip of punishment because the Jews are slipping? So the Rebbe says, don't worry about it. We don't have to worry about that. We don't have to say, well, but the Jews are supposed to be suffering. And if we were all so nice to the Jews and so compassionate, doesn't God want them to suffer because of their sins? Like, we'll let God deal with it. We'll let God figure that out. But from our end, we have to really try, as Noahides, people have to really try to empathize with the pain and to do whatever they can to alleviate that pain and whatever they can to be supportive and really help. And then the Rebbe goes into a whole long piece here of like, but wait a minute, the Jews are supposed to be in exile. So what are we saying here? And what the nations are going to be so nice to us? Aren't we supposed to be suffering in exile? And the Rebbe basically says, don't worry about it. And the Rebbe like proves that. I'm saying that in 2 words. The Rebbe proves that because the Rebbe says, look, when God first decreed exile on the Jews, right? That was in the covenant between the pieces. God told to Abraham that his children will be afflicted. They'll be strangers in a strange land. They'll be afflicted and enslaved for 400 years. And that's not really how it happened in history. God made it easier. Because in the end, the Jews were only in Egypt for 210 years. But God said 400. What happened to the other 190 years? Well, those 190 years, they were strangers in Israel because it wasn't their land, because it was controlled by foreigners. So they were foreigners, even though Israel is our land. So they were strangers in their own land for 190 years. And that was how God fulfilled 190 of the 400 years of this covenant he made with Abraham. And then, even when the Jews went into Egypt, where again, if you look at the words, they're written in the Bible very clearly, how God says, Vavadum ve'ino osam, they will be enslaved, they'll be afflicted. But we weren't enslaved and afflicted for 210 years in Egypt. In the beginning, we had it quite good. Joseph, he was the grand vizier of Egypt. He was, in essence, the de facto ruler. He sustained the Jewish people. He gave them food from the king's table. Pharaoh, he was serving us. He was taking care of us. He was dancing around our needs. The slavery only began when the last of the brothers of Joseph passed. The last brother to pass was Levi. So as long as even Levi was alive, the Jews were not enslaved. The Jews were rich and prosperous and doing quite well. For Jacob, for Yaakov, the last 17 years of his life, he was in Egypt, and those were the best years of his life. Those were the most peaceful years of his life. Those were the years that he had the least stress and the most joy. And yet these were part of the 210 years from the 400 years where God said, and they'll be enslaved and afflicted in this foreign land. So what do we see from here? We see that God can bend the rules a little. That even though God is saying that Jews are going to be enslaved and afflicted in a foreign land for 400 years, but 190 of those years they were independent in Israel, and that counted too because they were foreign control in Israel. And from the 210 years they were in Egypt, the first 17 years was Jacob's best years of his life. And even after Jacob passed, as long as any of the brothers were alive, the Jews were not afflicted and enslaved at all. They were rich and prosperous. I've calculated several times how many years were they enslaved. I calculated several times. Every time I forget and then want to check myself. It was about 116 years, 115, 100. So from God's original prophecy, promise, covenant with Abraham, that his children will be strangers, afflicted, enslaved for 400 years. They were afflicted and enslaved for 115, 116 years. Now, 115, 116 years of slavery is pretty harsh also. And as the years went on, it got worse and worse and worse. And the last 86 some years were really horrific. It gradually built up. In the beginning, it was a little more mild, a little more mild. The last 86 years were really intense, horrible years. But you can't compare that to 400 years. And God viewed it all. The 190 they were in Israel, the original about 90 some years when they weren't enslaved at all. And as it gradually built up, he didn't just view the last 86 or even the 116. He viewed it all as the 400 years. So why is Lubavitcher Rebbe telling us in a lot of detail this point? Because he wants us to understand that, yes, God is saying the Jews are in exile now. That doesn't mean God needs it to be a harsh, oppressive exile. You're like, but if it's not harsh and oppressive, the Jews won't repent. They'll forget. They won't repent. God has a lot of emissaries. He has a lot of messengers. He has a lot of way to get his point across. If Zechariah is being told that God is upset at the nations for being quiet when the Jews are suffering, that means God wants the world of Noahides, to do whatever they can to protect the Jewish people. And they Noahides don't have to worry that, but then the Jews might not repent. But then the Jews' exile won't be so harsh. God says, don't worry, let me handle that one. This is how God is saying he wants the world of Noahides to behave.
Can I make a comment on what you just said?
Absolutely.
You are totally right, because I am here to remind them that they are so special and that God has so much for them. The two people that I have been in, they're wonderful friends of mine. One of them came back to Judaism. She was over her anger because of a situation, and she said, I was angry and I left. And, she says, but because of your, I don't know how she said it, but anyway, because of your encouraging me and showing me what's wrong, and that, just basically saying, just basically showing me that there is wrong in everything. And just because I was wronged by certain rabbis doesn't mean that I'm going to be wrong by all rabbis. And so anyway, and I'm not trying to say anything about me. I'm just trying to say that it's what you were saying. We're supposed to be the light for the Jewish people. We're supposed to show them how treasured they are and how important it is for them not to follow the laws of the Gentiles, to be a separate people. And that's why I keep telling them, you guys, you're so special, and you don't want to do things like that like normal people, like I used to do. I don't do anymore either, but
That's beautiful, Dixie. Anyone else? Any other people, their input on this, how they feel about this? Sabra, Danielle.
I like what Dixie said. I like her example that she lives. It's beautiful.
I think so too, because she's really saying, I'm not only there to try to make it easier, I'm there to be a moral guide.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Any other practical applications? Any other practical applications you can see to this for in your own lives and dealing with the Jews in your world or in the broader world?
I want to say it's only by the grace of Hashem. It's all him. Everything's him. And what he allows me to do is totally from him.
Did anyone else see any practical applications, how they can? Because I thought this was really strong. I never saw this before. I was searching last night, what should I teach? I was going through various things, and then I found this. I'm like, wow, I want to share this. This really struck me. This vision that the Rebbe is explaining from this prophecy of Zechariah, this vision of the world of, don't be God's tool for bad. God has his plans, but you don't want to be his tool for bad. You don't want your bad and his vision to become one. You do have, some choice, and if you are his tool for bad, that means it's reflecting the bad inside of you. You can't say, well, the world is God's and God's running the show, so God wants the Jews to be abused, and I just happen to be the one doing it. No. If you're the one doing it, that's a reflecting your own inner evil. We never want bad to happen through us. We never want to be the tools God's using, because that would mean that's our state. But then this other piece, because I don't think people here are really going in that direction, but this other piece that I thought was really powerful, and just this vision of, you cannot be cruel. You can't, not only, that doesn't mean you just personally can't be cruel, you can't allow cruelty in the world. And you could say, well, I live in Kansas or Colorado or Indiana. I mean, there's no Jews where I live anyway. I'm not being cruel to any Jews. I'm not even seeing other people being cruel to Jews. Well, we live in a small global village today.
Mhm.
There's a lot of stuff going on in the world. There's a horrific rise of anti-Semitism in the world. Horrific, crazy. It'd be a terrifying world, but I'm a believer. But if I wasn't a believer, it would be a terrifying world. And the Rebbe is saying that every Noahide has to be actively involved in doing whatever they can. And obviously, every one of us has different things we can do. One person, it's in social media. For one person, it's in terms of personal relationships. Dixie is saying it in terms of reminding Jews they're Jews. Someone else, it could be standing up to how, if Jews are being treated inappropriately. I was shocked. I don't know why I was shocked, but I was shocked. This is in my neighborhood, okay, West Rogers Park, which happens to be a very religious Jewish neighborhood, but obviously wasn't always like that. A corner of my block, across my street, there's this big apartment building, and a Jew bought it, a religious Jew. This is a very, religious Jewish area. And he said to my husband that when his lawyer reviewed the legal papers of the building, there was a clause there that no Jews, blacks, or gays are you're not allowed to rent to them apartments. And he was like, whoa. Never mind, he's a Jew buying this building. But he's like, I have to change this now. He says, you never know what could happen in the world. You never know what someone can do to you in the world if this is what's legally written. But to imagine a world where this is written is just showing like, yeah, legal. I don't know if any Jews ever did live in that apartment building, but that was the premise. That was the mindset of the people that originally built, owned, bought this building. Who knows how many years ago?
Wow.
So definitely it's a mandate, and definitely I think the mandate is each person in their own world thinking, how does this apply to me? Are there Jews in my world that I'm supposed to be trying to help remind them they're Jewish, like Dixie is saying? Are there Jews in my world that are being victimized and I can't be quiet and passive and I don't want to make a scene? I have to figure out a way of standing up in support. Are there Jews in the world that are being victimized? And what can I do to make a difference? This was the message from this talk, and I thought, unfortunately, the timely message, and that's why I wanted to share it.